The Technique of Nonviolent Action by Gene Sharp. A ruler's power is ultimately dependent on support from the people he would rule. His moral authority, economic resources, transport system, government bureaucracy, army, and police, to name but a few immediate sources of his power, rest finally upon the cooperation and assistance of other people. If there is general conformity, the ruler is powerful. But people do not always do what their rulers would like them to do. The factory manager recognizes this when he finds his workers leaving their jobs and machines so that the production line ceases operation, or when he finds the workers persisting in doing something on the job which he has forbidden them to do. In many areas of social and political life, comparable situations are commonplace. A man who has been a ruler and thought his power sure may discover that his subjects no longer believe he has any moral right to give them orders, that his laws are disobeyed, that the country's economy is paralyzed, that his soldiers and police are lax in carrying out repression or openly mutiny, and even that his bureaucracy no longer takes orders. When this happens, the man who has been ruler becomes simply another man, and his political power dissolves, just as the factory manager's power does when the workers no longer cooperate and obey. The equipment of his army may remain intact, his soldiers uninjured and very much alive, his cities unscathed, the factories and transport systems in full operational capacity, and the government buildings and offices unchanged. Yet because the human assistance which had created and supported his political power has been withdrawn, the former ruler finds that his political power has disintegrated. Nonviolent action. The technique of nonviolent action, which is based on this approach to the control of political power and the waging of political struggles, has been the subject of many misconceptions. For the sake of clarity, the two terms are defined in this section. The term technique is used here to describe the overall means of conducting an action or struggle. One can therefore speak of the technique of guerrilla warfare, of conventional warfare, and of parliamentary democracy. The term nonviolent action refers to those methods of protest, non-cooperation, and intervention in which the actionists, without employing physical violence, refuse to do certain things which they are expected or required to do, or do certain things which they are not expected or are forbidden to do. In a particular case, there can of course be a combination of acts of omission and acts of commission. Nonviolent action is a generic term. It includes the large class of phenomena variously called nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, passive resistance, positive action, and nonviolent direct action. While it is not violent, it is action and not inaction. Passivity, submission, and cowardice must be surmounted if it is to be used. It is a means of conducting conflicts and waging struggles, and is not to be equated with, though it may be accompanied by, purely verbal dissent or solely psychological influence. It is not pacifism, and in fact has in the vast majority of cases been applied by non-pacifists. The motives for the adoption of nonviolent action may be religious or ethical, or they may be based on considerations of expediency. Nonviolent action is not an escapist approach to the problem of violence, for it can be applied in struggles against opponents relying on violent sanctions. The fact that in a conflict one side is nonviolent does not imply that the other side will also refrain from violence. Certain forms of nonviolent action may be regarded as efforts to persuade by action, while others are more coercive. Methods of nonviolent action. There's a very wide range of methods or forms of nonviolent action, and at least 197 have been identified. They fall into three classes: nonviolent protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and nonviolent intervention. Generally speaking, the methods of nonviolent protest are symbolic in their effect and produce an awareness of the existence of dissent. Under tyrannical regimes, however, where opposition is stifled, their impact can in some circumstances be very great. Methods of nonviolent protests include marches, pilgrimages, picketing, vigils, haunting officials, public meetings, issuing and distributing protest literature, renouncing honors, protest immigration, and humorous pranks. The methods of nonviolent non-cooperation, if sufficient numbers take part, are likely to present the opponent with difficulties in maintaining the normal efficiency and operation of the system. And in extreme cases, the system itself may be threatened. Methods of nonviolent non-cooperation include various types of social non-cooperation, such as social boycotts, economic boycotts, such as consumers boycott, traders boycott, rent refusal, and international trade embargo. Strikes, such as a general strike, strike by resignation, industry strike, go slow, and economic shutdown. And political non-cooperation, such as boycott of government employment, boycott of elections, administrative non-cooperation, civil disobedience, and mutiny. The methods of nonviolent intervention have some features in common with the first two classes, but also challenge the opponent more directly. And assuming that fearlessness and discipline are maintained, relatively small numbers may have a disproportionately large impact. Methods of nonviolent intervention include sit-ins, fasts, reverse strikes, nonviolent obstructions, nonviolent invasion, and parallel government. The exact way in which methods from each of the three classes are combined varies considerably from one situation to another. Generally speaking, the risks to the actionists on the one hand and to the system against which they take action on the other are least in the case of nonviolent protest, and greatest in the case of nonviolent intervention. The methods of non-cooperation tend to require the largest numbers, but not to demand a large degree of special training from all participants. The methods of nonviolent intervention are generally effective if the participants possess a high degree of internal discipline and are willing to accept severe repression. The tactics must also be selected and carried out with particular care and intelligence. Several important factors need to be considered in the selection of the methods to be used in a given situation. These factors include the type of issue involved, the nature of the opponent, his aims and strength, the type of counteraction he is likely to use, the depth of feeling both among the general population and among the likely actionists, the degree of repression the actionists are likely to be able to take, the general strategy of the overall campaign, and the amount of past experience and specific training the population and the actionists have had. Just as in military battle, weapons are carefully selected, taking into account such factors as their range and effect, so also in nonviolent struggle, the choice of specific methods is very important. Mechanisms of change. In nonviolent struggles, there are broadly speaking three mechanisms by which change is brought about. Usually there is a combination of the three. They are conversion, accommodation, and nonviolent coercion. George Lackey described the conversion mechanism thus. By conversion, we mean that the opponent, as a result of the actions of the nonviolent person or group, comes around to a new point of view which embraces the ends of the nonviolent actor. This conversion can be influenced by reason or argument, but in nonviolent action it is also likely to be influenced by emotional and moral factors, which can in turn be stimulated by the suffering of the nonviolent actionists, who seek to achieve their goals without inflicting injury on other people. Attempts at conversion, however, are not always successful. It may not even be made. Accommodation as a mechanism of nonviolent action falls in an intermediary position between conversion and nonviolent coercion, and elements of both of the other mechanisms are generally involved. In accommodation, the opponent, although not converted, decides to grant the demands of the nonviolent actionists in a situation where he still has a choice of action. The social situation within which he must operate has been altered enough by nonviolent action to compel a change in his own response to the conflict. Perhaps because he has begun to doubt the rightness of his position, perhaps because he does not think the matter worth the trouble caused by the struggle, and perhaps because he anticipates coerced defeat and wishes to accede gracefully or with minimum losses. Nonviolent coercion may take place in any of three circumstances. Defiance may become too widespread and massive for the ruler to be able to control it by repression. The social and political system may become paralyzed, or the extent of defiance or disobedience among the ruler's own soldiers and other agents may undermine his capacity to apply repression. Nonviolent coercion becomes possible when those applying nonviolent action succeed in withholding directly or indirectly the necessary sources of the ruler's political power. His power then disintegrates, and he is no longer able to control the situation, even though he still wishes to do so. Just as in war, danger from enemy fire does not always force front-line soldiers to panic and flee, so in nonviolent action repression does not necessarily produce submission. True repression may be effective, but it may fail to halt defiance, and in this case, the opponent will be in difficulties. Repression against a nonviolent group which persists in face of it and maintains nonviolent discipline may have the following effects. It may alienate the general population from the opponent's regime, making them more likely to join the resistance. It may alienate the opponent's usual supporters and agents, and their initial uneasiness may grow into internal opposition and at times into non-cooperation and disobedience. And it may rally general public opinion, domestic or international, to the support of the nonviolent actionists. Though the effectiveness of this last factor varies greatly from one situation to another, it may produce various types of supporting actions. If repression thus produces larger numbers of nonviolent actionists, thereby increasing the defiance, and if it leads to internal dissent among the opponent's supporters, thereby reducing his capacity to deal with the defiance, it will dearly have rebounded against the opponent. Naturally, with so many variables, including the nature of the contending groups, the issues involved, the context of the struggle, the means of repression, and the methods of nonviolent action used, in no two instances will nonviolent action work in exactly the same way. However, it is possible to indicate in very general terms the ways in which it does achieve results. It is, of course, sometimes defeated. No technique of action can guarantee its user short-term victory in every instance of its use. It's important to recognize, however, that failure in nonviolent action may be caused not by an inherent weakness of the technique, but by weakness in the movement employing it, or in the strategy and tactics used. Strategy is just as important in nonviolent action as it is in military action. While military strategic concepts and principles cannot be automatically carried over into the field of nonviolent struggle, since the dynamics and mechanisms of military and nonviolent action differ greatly, the basic importance of strategy and tactics is in no way diminished. The attempt to cope with strategic and tactical problems associated with civilian defense, national defense by prepared nonviolent resistance, therefore needs to be based on thorough consideration of the dynamics and mechanisms of nonviolent struggle, and on consideration of the general principles of strategy and tactics appropriate to the technique, both those peculiar to it and those which may be carried over from the strategy of military and other types of conflict. Development of the technique. Nonviolent action has a long history, but because historians have often been more concerned with other matters, much information has undoubtedly been lost. Even today, this field is largely ignored, and there is no good history of the practice and development of the technique. But it clearly began early. For example, in 494 BC, the plebeians of Rome, rather than murder the consuls, withdrew from the city to the sacred mount, where they remained for some days, thereby refusing to make their usual contribution to the life of the city until an agreement was reached, pledging significant improvements in their life and status. A very significant pre-Gandhian expansion of the technique took place in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The technique received impetus from three groups during this period. First, from trade unionists and other social radicals, who sought a means of struggle, largely strikes, general strikes, and boycotts against what they regarded as an unjust social system, and for an improvement in the condition of working men. Second, from nationalists, who found the technique useful in resisting a foreign enemy, such as the Hungarian resistance against Austria between 1850 and 1867. And the Chinese boycotts of Japanese goods in the early 20th century, and third, on the level of ideas and personal example, from individuals such as Leo Tolstoy in Russia and Henry David Thoreau in the USA, who wanted to show how a better society might be created. With Gandhi's experiments in the use of nonviolent action to control rulers, alter policies, and undermine political systems, the character of the technique was broadened, and refinements were made in its practice. Many modifications were introduced, greater attention was given to strategy and tactics, the armory of methods was expanded, and a link was consciously forged between mass political action and the ethical principle of nonviolence. Gandhi, with his political colleagues and fellow Indians, demonstrated in a variety of conflicts in South Africa and India that nonviolent struggle could be politically effective on a large scale. He termed his refinement of the technique satyagraha, meaning roughly insistence and reliance upon the force of truth. In politics, its use is based upon the immutable maxim that government of the people is possible only so long as they consent either consciously or unconsciously to be governed.